Right, well, good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to day 2 of Genetic Genealogy Ireland 2013. And these series of lectures are sponsored by Family Tree DNA, who have a stand downstairs. So if you want to have a DNA test, you can actually have it done at the exhibition today. And this is the first time that Family Tree DNA or any of the commercial companies are actually offering DNA tests. So do go down, ask questions, and then choose which test you think is best for you. There's also on the back wall a list of free DNA tests. So if you have a particular surname, there are some people who are running surname projects at Family Tree DNA have offered to pay for your test. So if you want to get a free test, just check the poster at the back of the hall and see if your name is actually there. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Debbie Kennett. Debbie has been a genealogist for many, many years and has been a genetic genealogist almost since the beginning. Certainly for, well, coming up to 10 years now, isn't it?
About 6 or 7 years.
6 or 7 years? Well, coming up to 10. Debbie runs the Cruwys One Name Study, is a member of the Guild of One Name Studies, and has used genetic genealogy and DNA testing very successfully in her particular projects. So much so that she's written several books on the topic. DNA and Social Networking is one of the books, and the Surname Handbook is the other one, and you can get those on Amazon, well worth the buy. So Debbie is going to talk to us today about DNA for beginners, and I will hand over to Debbie and turn on your microphone. There we go, thank you. Debbie Kennett, ladies and gentlemen.
Can everyone hear me, first of all? Yes? Okay. Right, let's get started. Okay, so I'm going to be talking today about the 3 different types of DNA tests that you can use as an aid to your family history research. The first test is the Y-chromosome DNA test, which normally follows the path of surnames, in other words, the direct paternal line. The second test is the mitochondrial DNA test, which tracks the direct maternal line. And the third test is the newest of the 3 tests, which is an autosomal DNA test, which can be used to find your genetic cousins on all your family lines. And that goes back for about 4 or 5 generations. But first of all, I just want to say a few general things that apply to all types of DNA tests. One of the main messages I want to get across is that DNA is just another type of tool, another type of record that we can use in our family history research. The documentary records we're normally used to finding in archives, and we hope, in most cases, that those archives will survive. Unfortunately, that's not the case in Ireland. But the DNA is just another type of record that we use, but instead of it being a paper record, we have to extract the DNA, and it has to go off to a lab to be interpreted. There are many different uses for DNA testing. The Y-DNA test can be used to explore surnames and can actually provide insight into the evolution and the origins of a surname. We can use DNA testing to verify our family trees. We can use it to confirm relationships. And it can sometimes be very helpful to bridge gaps in the paper record. Sometimes the DNA can provide an answer where you cannot find an answer in the paper records. And there are some scenarios where the DNA testing can be particularly useful. Sometimes if you've got a brick wall in your research, if you've got an illegitimate line, if you're adopted, sometimes the DNA can provide clues to actually help you find out more about your identity. And it can also provide a geographical focus for your research. Sometimes you can match someone who has more information on their family tree than you have, and it can actually save you a lot of time and effort because you can focus your research in one particular area rather than, say, focusing on a whole country. And it can just be a nice social activity because you'll get matches with your genetic cousins, and sometimes those cousins become friends, and it can just be a nice social exercise. And the last use is some people get very interested in their deep ancestry, going way back beyond the time of surnames, and you can use the Y-DNA and the mitochondrial DNA test for that purpose. One thing the testing doesn't do, it does not replace your traditional paper trail research. You still have to do that. You use the 2 together. And it's not a very precise tool because it doesn't, unlike the paper records, it won't give you the names of your ancestors, it will give you matches with people. Then you have to go back to the paper records and see if you can find the name of the ancestor. And it also doesn't identify the exact relationship, it's all done on probability, so you get a range of possibilities, and again you have to go back to the paper trail and try and establish exactly what the relationship is. And also, as a correlation, it doesn't provide precise dates. So you'll be told you might share a common ancestor with someone, but it could be 200 years ago, it could be 400 years ago. One thing I always point out, if you're afraid of skeletons, stay out of closets. Sometimes it applies just as much to family history research as it does to DNA testing. Sometimes there are surprises. Sometimes people find out things that they may not want to find out. So you have to be prepared for all sorts of eventualities. And it also depends on your perspective. Some people might find a new half-sibling through DNA testing. It might be a blessing. Other people, it might be an embarrassment. It all depends on your perspective. And the other question that always comes up is whether or not you can actually get samples from deceased relatives. And unfortunately, that is not the case. The DNA testing has to be done on living people. If you wanted to dig up your ancestors, it would cost you an absolute fortune. You may not even get permission to do so. You have to go to the church authorities to get permission. And it's only in very rare instances when kings are discovered in car parks that so you can actually get the DNA tests done. But the DNA test is actually a long-term investment, and once the test has been done, that is a record that then survives. And with the company that we use, Family Tree DNA, you can even nominate a beneficiary so that someone can take over your DNA record, and that record will actually go on working for people in the future. So the first test we're going to look at is the Y-chromosome DNA test, which follows the paternal line. And the Y chromosome is what makes a man, and that is passed on from a father to his son. So you have to be a man to take a Y chromosome test. If you're a female, you need to find a male relative or your husband who's got the surname that you want to investigate. And there are lots and lots of females involved in the world of genetic genealogy, running surname projects, and we're all desperately trying to find lots of our male cousins to take the DNA tests on our behalf. And because of the correlation with surnames, we normally coordinate the testing within surname projects. There are now something like 8,000 surname projects at Family Tree DNA, so all the common names are represented. If you've got a rarer surname, that may not necessarily be in the database. And then within the surname projects, you can actually use the tests to verify existing family trees. You can use it to explore a surname, to work out perhaps where it originated, whether the surname has a single origin, a multiple origin. And also, if you have different variant spellings of a surname, you can work out which ones are related. And the Y-DNA test goes way back beyond the time of surnames and can help you if you wanted to explore your pre-surname history, but only on that one very specific paternal line. So this is just a reminder of the actual path of the transmission of the Y-DNA test. So it's just that upper line of your family tree. So if you wanted to test a different person, say you wanted to explore your maternal great-grandfather's line, you then have to trace that paternal line down through to the present generation and test that person instead. The test itself works because when the Y chromosome is passed on from the father to his son, it's passed on virtually unchanged. But every now and then you get tiny little errors when the DNA is copied, which we call mutations, and the test looks at particular locations on the Y chromosome where these mutations are known to occur. And we call these markers, and the markers that we use for the surname test are known as short tandem repeats. You don't need to know that name, but that's something you may just hear come up, and they're abbreviated to STRs. And then for each marker you get a number, and then the numbers all go into a database. So it's like a sort of number matchmaking game. And essentially, the more numbers that you match on, the closer you're related. But when you get a DNA test result, this is what it looks like. You just get a string of numbers. And that on its own is actually essentially meaningless, because just knowing you've got those numbers on particular markers doesn't tell you anything at all. And the technical name for that is a haplotype. So the value of the test is actually in the comparison process. You need to be in a database, you need to be comparing your numbers with other people, and that's something that Family Tree DNA actually do for you. They have the world's largest Y-chromosome database. They have over 600,000 men in their database now, so virtually everyone who tests has a pretty good chance of getting at least some matches. There are some people who don't have any matches. And then essentially the more markers that you match on, the closer the relationship. And if you have too many mismatches, then you don't share a common ancestor on that line in what we call a genealogical time frame. So just to show you how the matches work, this is an example from my own project where I've got two men. In this case, we know the family tree, and we've got a William Cruwys who emigrated to Canada, and I've tested one of descendants from two different brothers here. And when the results came in, you can see every single number lined up. They match on every single marker there, so they are what we call an exact match. So in that particular case, it's essentially confirmed the relationship. And we know that the Y-DNA line in both cases has actually been true. There's been no what we call NPEs, non-paternity events, or not the parent expected, as some people call it. Then when we add another result, this time this is an English person, we know he's descended from the same tree, but you can see in this case one of the numbers is slightly different. But just having one mismatch is within the allowance that we normally make, so that again is confirmed that this particular relationship is correct. And then we add an extra result. This is another English man, and in this case he's got the same number 27 as the other English man. So you can see here we've actually got the tree dividing into two branches purely based on the genetics. So I've got two Canadian men who have a number 28, and I've got two English men who have a number 27 on that particular marker. And when we add another result, this is someone with the same surname, but his results came in virtually, there's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 markers that actually match. So we know, even though he's got the same surname, his results do not match the others. He does not share a common ancestor on the direct paternal line. So when the results come in, they all get displayed on the Surname Project website. This is my own Cruwys DNA project. And
On your last slide there, how many markers do you have to have?
I'm going to come to that in a minute. I can only fit 25 on the slide,
right.
But it varies.
Okay, no, to match. How many do it need to match before you can say there's a relationship or not?
I'll come to that in a minute. So this is my Cruwys DNA project. And you can see that I've got people grouped in what we call genetic families or genetic groups. So they're in groups based purely on their Y-DNA matches. And for quite the rare surname Cruwys, I've ended up with 3 separate groups. One singleton I know is actually an illegitimate line, so he wasn't expected to match the others. But it's actually quite common, even if you have a rare surname, you never ever find that all the results match. You always seem to end up with at least 2 or 3 small little groups. You can order, there are different numbers of markers that you can order. When the tests were first introduced back in the year 2000, you could only order a 12-marker test. We don't tend to use a 12-marker test now because it ends up giving you, sometimes people can have literally 9,000 or more matches. And most of those matches are not within a genealogical time frame. You can sometimes order a 25-marker test, but that again is not usually used these days. So the standard entry-level test is a 37-marker test. And with that one, if you share the same surname with someone, you can usually be confident if you have a close match, that would be matching on, say, 34 out of 37 markers at a minimum, that you actually have a common ancestor with someone with that same surname. But you can also go up and order 67 markers or 111 markers. And it all depends on what your objectives are for testing. If you're trying to match with a different surname, it's actually a good idea to order the 67 marker test. So if you're exploring an illegitimate line, or if you're an adoptee and trying to find your biological surname, then the 67 marker test gives you much more confidence because you haven't got the extra clue of the surname. And the 111 marker test is for more advanced users. There are a few rare people, and it does sometimes happen with the Irish surnames in particular. If you match something that's called the Nile of the Nine Hostages signature, some of those people can have extraordinarily large numbers of matches. And I've got some people who have, at 67 markers, like 600 matches. So in those rare cases, you do have to go up to 111 markers.
So if you do the 37 test and get, say, 35, that's a common name. If you do the 111 and get 35, is that the same correlation?
Well, if you go up, the thing is, if you go up to 111 markers, you have to, the person you want to compare with also has to go up to 111 markers. So you're comparing 111 markers, and they actually broaden the parameters. I think you can have 10 mismatches at 111 markers. And that actually, but the more, if you have 10 mismatches at 111 markers, it's generally a much deeper relationship. I use the 111 markers because I'm exploring surnames going right back to the 1100s, and you haven't got the family trees to act as a calibration point, if you like.
But so if you had the 111 and match, say, 105, the 37, would you probably match all 37 or close?
Not necessarily, it can vary. And I have people who match on, say, only 10 out of 12 markers, and then they suddenly, when you go up to 67 markers, it's 63 out of 67. You just never know where the mismatches are going to occur. The panel of markers that they use between 26 and 37 is actually the fastest mutating panel of markers. That's where most of the mutations occur. When you go up to 67 markers, those markers mutate very slowly, the ones from 38 to 67. So they're more useful, especially for people who are interested in deep ancestry and want to use the haplogroup projects, which I'll mention later. If that's something you want to explore, then the 67 markers is useful for that.
Can you say again the area in which the mismatches tend to occur?
It's from the 26 to 37 markers. That's the fastest mutating panel. So when you take the test, you get a personal page on the Family Tree DNA website. This is my dad's page. Obviously, I don't have a Y-chromosome, so I had to get my dad to take a test for me. And here, these are his 37 marker matches. He's actually tested all the way up to 111 markers. You can see the matches at all the different testing levels, from 12 going right up to 111. These are his 37 marker matches. You do actually get the full name of the people that you match, but I've obviously obscured those here. And you can see he's got 3 people with the surname Cruwys that he matches, but he's also got a couple of other different surnames. And on the left you can see it says steps, so that's the number of mismatches. So he's only got 1 mismatch with the first 2 Cruwyses, 3 mismatches with the second one, and then once you get out to 4 mismatches, he's got some other surnames appearing in there. But that is quite common because obviously surnames are adopted at different times in different parts of the world. And in some places people only assume surnames very late in the day. And then you've also got all the illegitimate lines, people adopting different surnames for one reason or another. So the Y-DNA test ignores surnames, it matches purely on the genetics.
So what did that actually mean then for you when you saw those names? Are they...
Right, well, in this particular case, this has confirmed some parts of the family tree because in the first 2 cases, my dad's line was in Devon, and we had an emigrant line that went to Prince Edward Island in Canada, and we thought that they were related to our tree, but we couldn't actually prove it in the paper records because in Canada the marriage certificates don't give or in Prince Edward Island, Canada anyway, they don't give the names of the father. So we had a marriage of a William Cruwys in Canada, but we couldn't actually prove that William Cruwys was the one who was from the same parish as my dad's family in Devon. So the fact that we had this match here firmed up that tree. And then we also had a match with another person who didn't know, he could only take his tree back so far to 1782 in Marinsley in Devon. He matched our little group, and because of that, he was then able to hook in with my dad's family tree. We can't find a baptism. The baptisms in that particular parish just haven't survived, but we know that he somehow is related to the same tree as my dad's tree.
Excuse me. Could you hazard a guess as to how related those two people are? You know, did they match in Y-37? So the records go back to
Yes,
1800s.
it does give you can generate probabilities, but the probabilities can be quite wide. So I can have people matching. You can have two people matching on all 37 markers, and sometimes they will have very solid trees that will go right back to, say, the 1700s. But then you can also have a father and a son taking a test, and sometimes they will mismatch on one marker or even two markers. So there's a huge variation, and because of that, you can't give a precise date. All you can say is it's within a particular range, and it's more likely if they match on all 37 markers, it's a more recent relationship. So normally within a surname project, we try and build up a sort of a framework of DNA results, and once you've got a tree and you've tested different people from different parts of the tree, then the structure within the surname becomes much more apparent. And you can actually sometimes use particular mutations as branch markers. And as you saw with the early example with the Canadians, where they had one specific number. So anyone else who tests, if they have that one specific number on that marker, you can assign them to a particular branch of the family tree, even if they don't have the paper trail. Now, the other part of the Y-DNA test, it tells you about your deep ancestry. You get what's called a haplogroup assignment. And the haplogroups represent your branches on the human family tree. On the Y-chromosome tree, eventually all the different lineages coalesce back in Africa, and the common ancestor on that direct paternal line lived in Africa, so we think about 238,000 years ago. And then over time, different branches developed, and those lineages travelled around the world. And today, in the Y chromosome of living men, you actually you will see that different people in different parts of the world have different Y chromosome haplogroups. So men living in Africa, they predominantly have a haplogroup called haplogroup A, and also haplogroup B. If you're in India, you're quite likely to have a haplogroup H. And the Native Americans, they tend to be mostly one particular subgroup of haplogroup Q. But then also some of these haplogroups can turn up in unexpected places. So gypsies living in the British Isles, they are quite often come out as haplogroup H, which reflects their Indian ancestry. And we even had an African haplogroup A turning up in Yorkshire. There was a study published a few years ago that was thought to be related to possibly to the Romans bringing in African men in Yorkshire. So you just never know what you might get. Now, these are the main haplogroups that you would expect to find in Ireland. In Ireland, there's one particular haplogroup called R1b, which is predominant, and about 81% of men in Ireland belong to this one particular haplogroup R1b, and in some parts of Ireland it goes up to like 90% or more. Knowing that you're an R1b and you share the same haplogroup as most other Irishmen is not particularly helpful, but if you are interested in the deep ancestry, then you can join what we call a haplogroup project. And you can then go on and order different testing, and there are lots of different sub-branches of haplogroup R1b. And I think some of the projects this afternoon, that the speakers will be talking about that in more detail, if that's something you wanted to explore. And then you've got these small minority haplogroups that you will also sometimes find in Ireland. But you just never know until you test which one you're going to be. Some people find they become really interested in exploring this deep ancestry, and they actually find that more interesting than the surname research.
Are you only in one haplogroup, or are you in multiple?
No, you can only be in one. That's your branch of the human family tree. And if you the haplogroups always trump the STR markers, so you can sometimes have people who have quite closely matching markers, but they can be in different haplogroups. So even if the markers are close, if the haplogroup is different, then they are not matched.
Sorry, does that R1b, does that denote that they arrived in Ireland at a particular time in the past? Or what does it tell us about our?
Right, well that's something we're still trying to explore. If you wanted to get into discussions like that, you really need to be in the haplogroup projects. They all have their own discussion lists and there are various papers being published, but we don't really have all the answers as yet. There is one particular branch of R1b called L21, which is dominant in Ireland, and that's thought to be associated with Celtic ancestry. But the correlations are still not very secure, and really there's the next stage is there's a lot of ancient DNA analysis that's going on, and that is the thing that's going to give us the answers. The ancient DNA analysis has been very, very expensive, but the costs do seem to be coming down, and there's a lot more interest in that now. And Professor Dan Bradley, who was here yesterday speaking, said that that is now the main focus of his research. Now, for the male line, if you have any of the surnames on this list, you do qualify for a free Y-DNA test, or if you know of any males with these surnames, if they can come along to the show here, we can actually do a free DNA test for them. These tests are all sponsored by the surname projects. Our surname project administrators become we all get very enthusiastic about our DNA projects, and we always want more people with the surname to test. It seems every new result that comes in provides more answers, and sometimes new results even raise more questions than answers. So the more people that we have testing with each surname project, the more we learn about the surname. The list is also up on the wall, and it's also up on the Family Tree DNA stand downstairs. And if you go to the ISOG wiki, there's also a page in there where you can find a more complete list of free DNA tests. The wiki is on the handout. If you haven't got the handout, there are some on the way out there. So the next test we're going to look at is the mitochondrial DNA test, which follows the direct maternal line. And mitochondrial DNA is passed on by a mother to both her male and her female children. So both a male and a female can take the mitochondrial DNA test. And this traces the direct maternal line, your mother, your mother's mother, your mother's mother's mother, and so on back in time. And this is also a deep ancestry test. But it's not so useful as a genealogical tool, and one of the main reasons, of course, is that the surname changes with every generation, so you can't put mitochondrial DNA results in a surname project. You don't have that as a clue to find people to test for comparison purposes. And also, it mutates at quite a slow rate, so it means that the matches are less precise. So it confirms that two people are related, but it could be within quite a wide time scale. But it's also useful for deep ancestry purposes. You may remember some of you may have read the book by Professor Brian Sykes, The Seven Daughters of Eve, where he put forward the theory that all European people are descended from 7 clan mothers. The basic principle still holds, but there are actually rather more than 7 clan mothers now. But if you're interested in your deep ancestry on that line, then you can use this DNA test for that purpose. And whenever you see stories in the newspapers that DNA has been extracted from historical figures like Richard III, it's nearly always the mitochondrial DNA that's been used, because within each cell in your body there are lots and lots of mitochondria. So that of all the DNA, that's the type that's most likely to survive and that they can test. So just to show you the path of mitochondrial DNA transmission, people always seem to get very confused about this. It's not tracing every single person on your mother's side of the family. It's this one specific line, the bottom line of your family tree. So it's your mother, her mother, and so on back in time. Now this is the most technical I'm going to get, but this is the easiest way to explain the different types of DNA tests. The mitochondrial DNA is a circular molecule, and it's divided into 2 regions. There's a region at the top which is called the control region, and also known as the hypervariable region. And hypervariable means that it changes a lot. And when the first DNA tests came in, that was the only bit of the mitochondrial genome that you could have sequenced. And that is divided into two regions, HVR1 and HVR2. So you can now have just a basic, it's called the mtDNA plus test. That is now really, really cheap. That is just, it costs you about €30 to do that. When I paid for my mtDNA plus test several years ago, it cost about 4 times that. And the other thing that we can now do is we can sequence the whole of the mitochondrial genome. So rather than just doing that one region, we do the whole thing. That's all 16,000 bases in there. The control, the code, that's called the coding region, the other part of it, and that's where all the genes are. There are 37 genes in the mitochondrial genome. But the matches for mitochondrial DNA, even if you have the full sequence test, it can still be within a very wide time frame. So if you have an exact match at the full sequence level, there's a 90% probability you share a common ancestor within 16 generations, which is about 400 years. But about 10% of those matches could still fall outside that time frame, and they could perhaps go back over 1,000 years or more. So it's not very precise, but used in combination with the paper records, if you've got a particular problem that you want to investigate, it can be very useful. With mitochondrial DNA, we also use it for deep ancestry, and there are lots of different haplogroups. And just to confuse us, the mitochondrial DNA haplogroups do not correspond with the Y-DNA haplogroups. When the mitochondrial DNA haplogroups are first discovered, the first ones that were discovered were the ones in Native Americans. So the Native American haplogroups, A, B, C, and D, they got the first 4 letters of the alphabet. But the root of the tree is actually, again, in Africa, going back to mitochondrial Eve, who lived about 200,000 years ago. And the predominant haplogroups in Africa are the 3L haplogroups. And within Europe and the British Isles, the main haplogroups there are H, U, X, and all the other ones that you see there. X is also one that's found in Native Americans. It's a particular sub-branch of X that you have to have if you want to be a Native American. And then you've got, say in India, you've got the M haplogroup. So we find that sometimes there are people with ancestors who went out to British India, and it can actually be very useful. The mitochondrial DNA test can be very useful in that particular case, because sometimes the mitochondrial DNA test will be the only evidence that you've got a maternal line ancestor who was from British India, because all the troops who were out there quite often married local Indian women. These are the main haplogroups that you would find in Ireland. Brian Sykes gave all the haplogroups names, which some people use, some people don't seem to like using. The predominant one is haplogroup H, which is found roughly in about 40% of people in Ireland. It's about the same percentage in Britain, and that also applies across most of Europe as well. And then you've got all these other haplogroups that you'll find at much lower percentages. I'm a U4, I'm an Ulrika, which is quite a rare one. And again, these haplogroups, they all have their own particular geographical distributions, and they all have their own ages. U4 and U5 tend to be the oldest ones. They are the ones that tend to turn up in a lot of the ancient DNA samples. You probably, everyone probably saw the news about Richard III. That's a very, very good practical example of how you can use mitochondrial DNA testing in combination with historical and paper records as additional evidence. The remains were dug up back in September, and Dr. Turi King at Leicester University was the one who did the ancient DNA analysis. That all has to be done in special labs. They have to wear all this fancy gear, and because you don't want it to be contaminated by modern DNA, and you have to be sure that it's from the sample is from the specimen being tested, because it's quite often only tiny little flakes of DNA that they get out. And it has to be done independently in 2 different labs as well. After Richard III, there was a historian called John Ashdown Hill who'd actually done a huge amount of genealogical research, And for another project, he'd actually traced the line of Richard III through a sister, going right down to a lady called Joy Ibsen. I think it was 15 generations, which is a phenomenal feat of genealogical research, because each time you've got to follow the mother line, and normally most people follow surnames. I dread to think how many years it took him to do that research. So she had her DNA tested quite a few years ago. She actually passed away in 2008. And then when the remains were discovered, they wanted to get another sample for reference purposes, and her son was tested. And he is a male, so he carries his mother's mitochondrial DNA. He would have the same DNA as his mother. Richard III obviously had there were no children, but as a male, he would not have passed his his mitochondrial DNA on to anyone else. So the only comparison samples could be taken. They had to be from a descendant of one of his sisters. And this is also a good example of how lines die out, because Michael Ibsen has 2 siblings, and none of them have any children. If these samples hadn't been taken when they did, if the remains had been discovered in, say, 50 years' time, there would not have been a reference sample for comparison purposes. The results of this haven't yet been published. There's been a lot of speculation. We believe Richard III's haplogroup is J1C2C, but it's never actually been officially confirmed. So if you do come out with J1C2C, then it's possible you could be related to Richard III. But the paper should be published within the next 6 months or so in Nature, the scientific journal. The final test we're going to look at is the autosomal DNA test, which is used for finding matches with cousins. And just a very brief biology lesson. We have 22 pairs. Each human cell has 46 chromosomes divided into pairs. We have 22 pairs of autosomes, and we have 1 pair of sex chromosomes. So if you're a female, you have 2 X's. You get 1 X from your mum, you get 1 X from your dad. If you're a male, you have an X and a Y. You get the X from your mum, and you get the Y from your dad. Now, the autosomal test looks at those 22 autosomes, and because we get the autosomes from both of our parents, the test can be taken by males and females. And it looks at between 700,000 and 1 million autosomal markers. These particular markers are known as SNPs. The autosomal DNA is inherited from all our ancestors, and it gives you matches with genetic cousins who share a common ancestor within about the last 5 or 6 generations. So it takes you back roughly about 200 years, but it can also give you matches with more distant cousins, but that gets much more complicated if you get a match with a 5th distant cousin, because it's much more difficult doing the paper trail research. But the complication with this test is that when you get a match with a cousin, the match could be on any of your lines. So you're given a predicted relationship, 2nd to 4th cousin, 3rd to 5th cousin. It's then up to you to go back to your family tree and to try and see if you can work out where you share that cousin. So for this test, you really need to do your genealogy research not just on one line, but on all your lines. Even if you're interested in one particular line, you need to do the research on the other lines for the purposes of elimination. There are 2 companies that currently offer this test. It was first offered by a company called 23andMe. They do it's mainly a health test, but they were the first people to introduce the cousin matching concept, and their cousin matching feature is called DNA relatives. The problem we find with the 23andMe database is that people tend to do the test for health reasons, and they don't really want to correspond for genealogical purposes. And also the 23andMe test works out much more expensive, because both these tests now cost $99. If you tested about 4 years ago, it would have cost you $500. The Family Finder test was $299 until about 3 months ago. But now both companies charge $99. But the 23andMe company, they insist on sending all their kits out by FedEx, so that effectively doubles the cost of the test. Whereas for the Family Tree DNA, they charge us $7 for shipping, so anyone in the world can order one of these tests. The 23andMe test is also limited to only 56 countries, so if you've got relatives in South Africa or Thailand or whatever, you wouldn't be able to even get them to test with that company. So for genealogical purposes, the company we use is Family Tree DNA and their Family Finder test. And when your results come in, this is what you get. This is my page of Family Finder matches, and I've also tested my mum and my dad, and the test successfully predicted that they were my parents. So I was rather relieved that that was the case. It would be rather embarrassing if they weren't. But you can see on there the predicted relationship. You can confirm the relationships once you know what it is. And it gives you a range. So these are some of the ones on my list as predicted second to fourth cousin and predicted third to fifth cousin. And then the match list goes on for quite a few pages. And then if you're lucky, people will provide a list of the surnames that you're researching. If you have a surname in common, that's highlighted in bold in the list. And you also, in fact, you get the full name and the email address of your matches. I didn't like to include them on the slides here. And then you can contact your matches, and then it's a question of saying, well, you know, we have this surname in common, these are my ancestors, do we actually, you can see if you can try and find the connection in your family tree.
If more people do tests, will that probability get smaller, or is it fixed at second to third cousin or second to fifth because of the test as opposed to the number of people?
No, the probability is based on the genetics and based on the algorithms used by the company. The algorithms can change, so sometimes those predictions will change. It can be difficult, especially for the more distant relationships, because there are so many variables. People can have ancestors with first cousins who married, and the algorithms don't know that. They can't take that into account. So they're basing it purely on the amount of shared DNA. And sometimes the people who are matches drop off the match list when they do adjust the algorithms. This is a comparison between a grandfather and a granddaughter. The way that the DNA is shuffled up with each generation, and it's all recombined, and it's a very random process, and you can see that from here. The orange blocks are the segments that they share in common on particular chromosomes. So it lists all the 22 autosomes. And you can see if you go down to, say, chromosome 18, they don't actually share any DNA in common at all, and the same on chromosome 22. Whereas when you look at chromosome 14, they share virtually the whole chromosome in common. So it's a very random process, and each person gets their own unique contribution of DNA from each of their parents. This is one of my own matches, in fact my husband's matches. This is someone who's predicted to be a second to fourth cousin, and you can see once you get out to this level, the only bit of DNA shared in common is this one orange block there on chromosome 7. But that big block there is sufficient to predict the relationship, but they can't predict that it's going to be closer than, any more accurate than somewhere between second to fourth cousin. And there's also all the complications of, you know, first cousins once removed, second cousins once removed. So actually trying to find the exact relationship can be complicated. But you get this very nice tool where you can actually compare the results of different people, and sometimes you can end up having the same people matching on the same chromosome, so actually having that same block of DNA. In this particular case, we identified the common ancestor, so we know this particular block of DNA came from someone with the surname Bodger from Cambridgeshire. And when we investigated his family tree, he actually had two first cousins who married each other, so that actually meant the DNA was much closer than we would expect normally. He tested another fourth cousin, and that didn't actually show up as a match. This just gives you an idea of the amount of DNA you would expect to share in common. So a mother and a father and siblings will all share about 50% of their DNA in common. You share about 25% of your DNA with your grandparents, your aunts, uncles, and half-siblings. And then with each generation, the amount of shared DNA gradually reduces. but these are only the average amounts. Within these averages there are variants, so you may get like 27% of your DNA from one grandparent, you may get 23% from another grandparent, and you can see that those variations, the further back in time you go, it can make it much more complicated. So when you get out to, say, a fifth cousin, sometimes you won't share any DNA at all with some of your fifth cousins, and others you will have DNA in common with them. So you can use the test just to go into the database and just search for matches and see what you get. But the test is probably best used if you've got a particular scenario that you want to investigate. So say you've got a great-grandfather and he married twice, and you're not sure if the children from the first marriage or from the second marriage are actually his children, or perhaps the children from a prior relationship. So you can test one person from each family and see if the results match and see if they share the expected amount of DNA for the relationship. And the test is very effective if you're testing people who are up to second cousins. We've not yet had a case of two second cousins not actually showing up as a match. When you get to third cousins, it's still very good. About 90% of third cousins will show up as a match, but that still leaves 10%, or 1 in 10 people who are third cousins can take this test and they won't actually show up as a match. So it doesn't mean that they're not third cousins, it just means that because of the random process of inheritance, they have not inherited enough DNA to show up as a match. When you get out to fourth cousins, only about 50% will show up as a match. But because we have so many fourth and fifth cousins, when you take one of these tests, you will actually get lots and lots of matches with your fourth and fifth and distant cousins. Some of them could be 7th, 8th, 9th and 10th cousins. So you will get, most of your matches will be with those distant cousins, but it's really the closer cousins that you want to focus on, because those are the ones you're standing most chance of finding the relationship with. Just to finish, a quick word about Family Tree DNA, the company that we normally use for all these genealogical DNA tests. They have the world's largest database for genealogical purposes, getting on for about 500,000 Y-DNA results and over 160,000 mitochondrial DNA results. All the surname projects, all the important ones, are run at Family Tree DNA. And the other nice feature about them is that they have all the different projects. So they have as well as the surname projects, there are geographical projects. There's a very nice Ireland DNA project. Margaret Jordan, the administrator, is in the audience here today. So you can, if you make sure you join her project and join the project for your haplogroup if you're interested in the deep ancestry. And they also have a really nice international database. They sell tests in every country of the world. So whatever your ancestry, you can, in the haplogroup projects, we've got people from Russia and Scandinavians, people from all over the world. So it's really nice having this international collaboration of people working together. If you're interested in the deep ancestry, they offer specialist tests called SNP tests, which you need to test your subclades. They're the only company that offer the full mitochondrial DNA sequence test. They're the only company that do the 111 marker test. And they also have a partnership with the Genographic project. And that has also helped to bring in lots of people from many different countries. The Genographic project has now tested over 600,000 people in 140 countries in the world. And people who take that test, they can transfer their results to Family Tree DNA. If you're looking for resources for DNA testing, I have done a handout. Some people have got the handout, or you can pick it up on the way out. ISOG, the International Society of Genetic Genealogy, is the main resource. We have a website. We also have a wiki where you can find lots of information about all these different tests. I have written a book about DNA and social networking. The first half of that book does cover all the different types of DNA tests. And my surnames book covers how to research a surname, but does also include a chapter on Y-DNA projects and Y-DNA testing. So just to sum up, there are 3 different DNA tests: the Y-DNA test for the direct paternal line, mitochondrial DNA for the maternal line, and the autosomal DNA test to give you matches on all the different lines. So it's a question of seeing what research problem you want to solve and choosing the best test to fit the scenario. The other important point is you must test people while you still have the chance, and it's always best to test the oldest generation, especially for the family finder test. It's best to test the parents, your parents or your grandparents, because they will actually take you further back in time as well. The prices have been tumbling in the last year, and the tests are really now more affordable than they ever have been. The autosomal test is, as I say, is now about $99. It's €79 at the show here. And if you, in the year 2000, if you wanted to have your DNA sequenced, it would cost you $3 billion. So why not give it a try? Oops.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Debbie, for a fantastic lecture. You answered a few questions during the presentation, and we're a little bit short of time, so I can only just take one or two urgent questions. But having said that, Debbie, you're going to be downstairs at the Family Tree DNA
Yes,
stand?
I will, yes. Yep.
Okay, so Debbie's going to be down there. Please feel free to approach her at the stand. There's a variety of other volunteers there as well who are also very knowledgeable about DNA, so do please make your way down there and ask them any questions that you have. Now, there was a lady here who had a quick question.
It just on the autosomal DNA, you're also told what percentage your
Right, yes,
ancestry is from different places.
Yes, I was trying not to mention too much about that because at the moment it's not very informative. I've got a couple of slides here. This is my ancestry. This is from the 23andMe test, and it really isn't very helpful at the moment. All my ancestry is from Britain, and it tells me that I am 56% from British and Irish. And the rest of it is very vague, and it says French and German and Scandinavian. The problem with this type of test is there aren't enough reference populations at the moment to give accurate predictions, and it's also very difficult to distinguish between, say, a French person and an English person. A French friend of mine has taken this 23andMe test, and he's come out with 25% British. And all his ancestry is French, so they just give you sort of arbitrary labels. It's done from an American perspective. The Americans want to have matches over here, but it doesn't really. It's not really very meaningful for if all your ancestry is from Ireland or from Britain. This is my results with the Family Tree DNA. Have something called a population finder, and I come out, mostly Europe. Different types of Europe, Western Europe and Europe, which is, I didn't need a DNA test to tell me that. It is more interesting it can distinguish at the continental level, so between Asian and African and European. If you get a signal of Asian or African on one of these tests, then that is significant. But within the European level, at the moment it's not very meaningful. But that will change. Once you get these results, they will be updated as more reference populations become available, but the limitation at the moment is with the reference populations.
Let's have one last question. This gentleman here.
One quick question on transferring. Can you not transfer from 23andMe to Family Tree DNA?
Yes, you can do.
Here.
It costs $69 to do
Right.
the transfer. And so
I've done it in the U.S. and I wondered, here in Ireland or in the UK for that matter.
Yes, you can do. It doesn't
Okay.
matter where you are, you
Okay.
can do that. If you wanted to be in both databases, then actually the cheapest way, I probably shouldn't be saying this here, but the cheapest way to do that is to test with 23andMe first and then transfer to Family Tree DNA.
Yes, that's what they do in the U.S. So.
Yeah. But,
Well, that was a question.
but the problem with the 23andMe for us over here is the shipping costs, which means people look at the test
Just
and they
have
see
to
it's
get
$99, and then you suddenly
from the
look at it,
US.
and then you have to pay almost as much again to have the kit shipped over
I
here.
understand.
So it's not $99 is not $99 for us. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Can I ask you to join me in thanking Debbie for such a wonderful presentation? Thank you, Debbie. And like I said, Debbie will be downstairs at the Family Tree DNA stand. I'm sure you have lots of questions. Please approach her there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.